Now, look, it turns out that 5 NATO Secretary Generals have, in fact, written a letter this evening expressing concern that Britain might leave the EU, saying it's the impositions of sanctions on Iran and Russia, led from within the EU by the UK, has been a striking example of the importance of this union for our security. So what's going on here is that your side keeps talking about NATO, and yet when you talk to the NATO people, they say, please stay in the EU.
Well, I think that, first of all, you have to accept, as the Prime Minister said today, that there's no reason why we couldn't get some relations in the issues that you mentioned on sanctions, for example, in bilateral arrangements or even through some EU arrangements themselves. And I think that you need to look at this picture in the round. And I'm not actually one of those who says that everything that the EU has done has been bad in terms of security. I personally believe that the ability to bring Spain and Greece and Portugal from military dictatorships was one of the things that the EU actually did successfully. And I think it was able to act as a beacon for those countries under the Soviet oppression and show them there was an alternative future of freedom and democracy. So I think that was important, but I don't think that the European Union understood the significance of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I think it stuck to an old trajectory set in the 1950s in a world which is very different. And against those very positive elements that I mentioned, you have the great EU disaster that was the Balkans, 100,000 dead because of Europe's dithering and the inability of the European Union to get its act together. So I think you have to look at them on both sides. And as far as NATO is concerned, my worry is that you've got far too few European countries pulling their weight inside NATO at the present time, seeing the EU as some sort of soft option for them in terms of defence, with the US therefore having to carry 72% of NATO's budget this year.
And do you think it will get better if we leave the EU, that the Europeans will put more into NATO if Britain isn't there? Because this is the kind of one of the things people argue, is that by us being there, we are actually making the case that ties Europe to NATO much better than if we're not there, surely.
And it is an argument, but I think there's another argument that is even stronger, and that is that while Britain is there, us being the 5th biggest military budget in the world, it gives the EU the belief that it's got capabilities that it doesn't really have, and it gives the EU pretensions. And there are those in the European project who've always seen NATO as an impediment to the concept of ever closer union, because it denies them access to that policy space. And I think Britain outside the European Union would make it very clear that the European Union itself has very little defence capability. It needs to have that, as well as its contribution to NATO, but it ends the pretense, and I think, of what's a dangerous delusion.
Well, I mean, look, I don't want the whole debate to just be what other people are saying, but it's very interesting. The Times tomorrow morning is carrying a letter, it's leading on it actually, a letter from 13 former US Secretaries of State and Defence and National Security Advisors to say that the country's, Britain's place and influence in the world would be diminished and Europe would be dangerously weakened after a vote to leave. And that's Republicans, Democrats, you've got George Shultz, who worked for Ronald Reagan, the whole lot of them. I mean, basically, the entire defence and security establishment that you want us to be attached to and a part of and are relying on it as a substitute or a complement to the EU, all say, stay in, please stay in.
And I think that a lot of those people are from a very different era from the one that we're in now, and I can understand why that they would have thought that then. But I think we're entering into a very different period in terms of global security structures. I happen to believe that the United Kingdom outside the European Union would actually give an impetus to the political aspects of NATO, which I think have been long neglected. And I think they would give a bit of a kick to some of those European countries who seem to believe that we can do the heavy lifting in terms of hard power and they can do the soft power elements. That's not how it works in the world. If you want to be a peacekeeper, there has to be a peace to keep, and sometimes that has to be fought for.
Well, can you explain what Boris Johnson's point was today? Because he actually made the argument that the EU, far from creating security, has created instability in Ukraine. He said it was an example of policymaking on the hoof. Pretensions to running a defence policy caused real trouble. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, there are those who think that the EU's arrangements with Ukraine were actually provocative from a Russian perspective. That may or may well, that may or may not be true. For me, that's not actually the point. The point is that
do you think it? Do you agree? Do you agree with that? Because it is quite a big point. A lot of people have said it. Other Leave politicians have made the point But a lot of people are saying that's just a blatant argument that we should appease Putin.
Well, yes, the point I'm coming to make is it doesn't matter actually whether it's true or not, because...
But I want to know whether you believe it. I know you say it doesn't matter, but just do you think it is the case that Europe provoked Putin and thus caused instability, or do you think Europe was doing a good thing by trying to help Ukraine, if it wanted to leave the Russian ambit, move out of the Russian ambit?
Well, it may be both. I mean, I think that they were trying to help Ukraine, but I think it was seen as provocative by Russia. My view is that Russia has no right to determine what they call their near abroad, in other words, having a veto on the foreign or security policies of their immediate neighbours. That's a remnant of old Soviet
So you
thinking.
actually are completely at the odds with Boris Johnson on this particular point, aren't you?
No,
I mean,
I'm not, as I'm
this is an
explaining.
example.
No, I'm not, as I'm explaining, I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. I just don't think that Russia has a right to have the opinions that it has at the present time about its neighbours. Countries are entitled to self-determination, and just as Poland or the Baltic states have a right to self-determination, so does Ukraine.
Just a very quick last one. Is your hope that if Britain leaves, other countries will also leave and that the EU may in some way dismantle? Michael Gove has called this a democratic liberation of a whole continent that may be started by our leaving. Is that your hope? And do you think that would be conducive to stability in Europe if that occurred?
No, I don't want that to happen. What I want to happen is that those who are in charge of Europe at the present time recognise that they're going in a fundamentally flawed direction. They're creating the rise of nationalism across Europe, with extreme political parties getting more powerful, and we're seeing a whole generation of young Europeans sacrificed on the altar of the single currency, with all the social problems that that brings, and is likely to bring security problems in its wake. And that's before we get to the mass migration that's been made easier by the disaster that is Schengen. I hope that a British exit would actually bring to the senses those who are taking Europe in the wrong direction before they bring the whole house down on themselves. That would not be good for Britain. It would not be good for Europe. And I hope that Britain can actually, for the third time in a century, bring Europe to its senses and stop it doing what is extremely dangerous.
Liam Fox, thanks ever so much. Thanks.